In 1945, the U.S. military manufactured nearly 500,000 Purple Heart medals. They were meant for the men who would bleed during the invasion of Japan. That invasion never happened. But here's the thing, those medals were never destroyed. There were so many that 60 years later, soldiers wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan were still receiving Purple Hearts stamped in 1945, for a war that never took place. So if America had already prepared for a world without the bomb, was dropping it on Hiroshima really the only option? By the summer of 1945, Japan had already lost the war. Everyone knew it. The problem was, Japan refused to admit it. Let me give you the picture. On the night of March 9, 1945, 5 months before Hiroshima, 279 B-29 bombers dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. In a single night, more than 90,000 people were killed. 16 square miles of the city, gone. Over 250,000 buildings, erased. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, more destructive than Nagasaki. And most people today have never even heard of it. And that was just the beginning. By August, American B-29s had firebombed 67 Japanese cities. Operation Starvation, an aerial mining campaign, had sunk or damaged 670 ships. Shipping through the Shimonoseki Strait, Japan's lifeline, had collapsed to 10% of normal. 35 of 47 critical convoy routes were abandoned. The 1945 rice harvest was failing. Famine was coming. And yet, Japan would not surrender. Here's why. The real power in Tokyo sat with 6 men, the Supreme War Council. 3 of them, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai, wanted to find a way out. But the other 3, War Minister Anami, Army Chief Umezu, and Navy Chief Toyoda, refused to consider surrender unless America agreed to 4 conditions. Keep the emperor, no foreign occupation, Japan disarms itself, and Japan conducts its own war crimes trials. Under Japanese cabinet rules, decisions required unanimity. 1 dissenter could block everything, and 3 were dissenting. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration. Unconditional surrender, or face, prompt and utter destruction. The declaration deliberately said nothing about whether Hirohito could stay. That ambiguity was fatal. Prime Minister Suzuki publicly responded with a single word, mokusatsu. For decades, people have called this a tragic mistranslation, that Suzuki meant no comment, but the Americans heard, we reject it. Recent scholarship in the Pacific Historical Review put that myth to rest. Mokusatsu meant what it sounded like. Japan said no. So by early August 1945, Harry Truman was staring at a country that had been firebombed into rubble, starved by a naval blockade, abandoned by its last potential mediator, and still would not quit. He had 4 doors in front of him, and behind every single one was a nightmare. Now, here's the question that still splits historians 80 years later. Was dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima really the only way out? Or did Truman have other options? Options that could have ended the war without vaporizing 140,000 people? The standard answer most of us learned in school goes something like this. The bomb saved 1 million American lives by preventing a land invasion of Japan. Case closed. But when you actually dig into the documents, the declassified cables, the internal memos, the post-war testimonies, the picture gets a lot messier. Because Truman didn't face a simple choice between bomb and invade. He had 4 doors. Door 1, drop the bomb, the fastest option. But 140,000 civilians die, mostly in the first few seconds. Door 2, Operation Downfall, a full-scale amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. The military had already planned it down to the beach. They'd manufactured 500,000 Purple Heart medals for the casualties they expected. That's not a metaphor. They literally made the medals. Door 3, tighten the blockade and keep firebombing. Starve Japan into submission. But how many millions of civilians starve to death while you wait? Door 4, diplomacy. Accept Japan's conditional surrender. And behind the scenes, Japan had already been sending messages through Switzerland. But here's the catch. The men with the guns in Tokyo might not obey the men with the pens. Now, I want to be clear about what comes next. Everything I've told you so far, that's documented history. What we're about to do is walk through each of those doors and examine what was waiting on the other side. This is a hypothetical analysis built on real military plans, real intelligence data, and real geopolitical realities. It's not what happened, it's what could have happened, and what almost did. And honestly, when I started researching this, I thought I knew the answer. I didn't. Before we walk through those doors, if you're the kind of person who likes history that asks hard questions instead of giving easy answers, hit subscribe. I break down one alternate history scenario every week, and some of them are genuinely unsettling. All right, let's start with door 2, the invasion. Operation Downfall was not a sketch on a napkin. It was the most detailed invasion plan in military history, and the United States was dead serious about executing it. The plan had 2 phases. Phase 1, Operation Olympic, was set for November 1st, 1945. 14 American and Marine divisions would storm the beaches of southern Kyushu, Japan's southernmost major island. Behind them, 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, over 400 destroyers. It would have been the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, dwarfing D-Day. The objective was simple: seize the southern third of Kyushu and turn it into a giant airbase for Phase 2. Phase 2, Operation Coronet, was planned for March 1946. 25 divisions would land on the Kanto Plain and drive straight for Tokyo. If Kyushu was D-Day, Coronet was the march to Berlin. Combined, Downfall would have put over 3.5 million Allied troops on Japanese soil. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Americans thought they had surprise on their side. They didn't. Japan knew exactly where the landings would happen, and they had a plan of their own. It was called Ketsugo, the decisive operation. Japan had moved between 5,000 and 10,000 aircraft into hidden positions across Kyushu, roughly half of them rigged for kamikaze strikes. They'd built suicide motorboats packed with explosives. They'd developed human-guided torpedoes, and they'd mobilized the civilian population, men, women, teenagers, into a militia called the Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps, armed with bamboo spears, grenades, and the instruction to die before surrendering. Japan's goal wasn't to win. It was to bleed the Americans so badly that Washington would accept a negotiated peace rather than fight to the finish. And the terrifying part? American intelligence knew something was wrong. Through Ultra, the same signals intelligence that cracked the Enigma code in Europe, the US was watching Japan's troop buildup on Kyushu in real time. In April, there were roughly 62,000 Japanese troops on the island. By July, that number had exploded past 500,000, heading toward 900,000. The comfortable 3-to-1 force ratio the planners had counted on was collapsing toward 1-to-1. That's not an invasion, that's a meat grinder. On August 7th, one day after Hiroshima, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall sent an urgent cable to General MacArthur, essentially asking, "Should we cancel Olympic?" MacArthur's response was pure MacArthur. "There should not be the slightest thought of changing the Olympic operation," he wrote. "The plan is sound and will be successful." He dismissed the intelligence entirely. But behind closed doors, the Joint Chiefs were fracturing. The Navy, Admirals King and Nimitz, had turned against the invasion. The Air Force wanted to bomb Japan into submission without setting foot on the islands. Marshall himself was quietly asking a question that no one wanted to say out loud. Could they use atomic bombs tactically on the invasion beaches? He was told 7 would be available by November 1st. And then there was one more factor that almost nobody talks about. On October 9th, 1945, 6 weeks after Japan surrendered, Typhoon Louise slammed into Okinawa, the main staging base for Olympic. 12 ships sank. 222 were driven ashore. 32 were damaged beyond repair. 80% of the buildings on the island were destroyed. If the war had still been going, that typhoon would have delayed the invasion by at least 45 days, giving Japan even more time to dig in. So what would the butcher's bill have looked like? That depends on who you ask, and that's part of the problem. Truman later claimed the bomb saved 500,000 American lives, but Stanford historian Barton Bernstein went back to the actual 1945 planning documents and found something very different. The Joint War Plans Committee's estimate from June 15, 1945, the number the decision-makers were actually working with, projected around 40,000 Americans killed and 150,000 wounded. Still horrific, but a long way from 500,000. Bernstein called Truman's number a post-war myth with no basis in the archival record. The real nightmare wasn't just the American casualties, it was what would happen to Japan. Estimates ranged from 5 to 10 million Japanese dead, military and civilian combined. And here's the detail that still haunts me. The US military ordered nearly 500,000 Purple Heart medals manufactured in advance for downfall. That invasion never happened. But the medals were so numerous that every American soldier wounded in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan received a Purple Heart stamped in 1945 for a battle that never took place. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the invasion was a horror show, but what about just waiting? Seal Japan off, keep bombing, and let starvation do the work. That's door 3. And on paper, it looked like the humane option. By August 1945, Operation Starvation had already crippled Japan's ability to feed itself. 12,000 aerial mines had shut down the harbors. Kobe's shipping had dropped 85% in 4 months. And the B-29s weren't just dropping mines, they were systematically burning every city they could reach. By the time Hiroshima happened, 67 Japanese cities had already been firebombed. Curtis LeMay was literally running out of targets. And here's the thing that makes this option look almost reasonable. In 1946, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive government study conducted after the war, concluded, and I quote, that Japan would have surrendered, certainly prior to December 31, 1945, and in all probability prior to November 1st, even without the atomic bombs, even without the Soviet invasion, and even if no land invasion had been planned. That sounds pretty definitive, right? Case closed. The bomb was unnecessary? Not so fast, because when later historians, including Richard Frank and Barton Bernstein, who disagreed with each other on almost everything else, went back and looked at the bombing survey's own evidence, they found something strange. The Japanese officials who told survey interviewers that surrender was coming anyway, they only said that after, as Bernstein put it, some coaxing. Prime Minister Suzuki and Prince Konoe actually told the survey the opposite, that the war likely would have continued through the end of 1945 without the bomb. The survey's famous conclusion, Frank argued, was not supported by its own evidence. But let's set the historiography aside for a moment and ask the harder question. Even if blockade eventually worked, what would it cost? Japan's 1945 rice harvest was already failing. The transportation network was shattered. B-29s had destroyed bridges, rail lines, and tunnels across the country. Food couldn't move from farms to cities. Japanese officials estimated after the war that if surrender had been delayed even a few months, roughly 11 million people would have starved to death through 1946. 11 million. That's more than 70 Hiroshimas. So door 3, the humane option, might have killed more people than the bomb it was supposed to replace. Let that settle for a moment. Which brings us to door 4, diplomacy. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because Japan wasn't just sitting in Tokyo waiting to die. They were trying to negotiate, sort of. Through the spring and summer of 1945, Foreign Minister Togo had been desperately trying to use the Soviet Union as a go-between. He sent cable after cable to Ambassador Sato in Moscow, pleading for Soviet mediation. On July 12th, Togo told Sato that the emperor himself wished to end the war. And here's the thing, the Americans knew. Through magic, the program that had cracked Japan's diplomatic codes, Washington was reading every one of those cables in near real time. So the revisionists ask a devastating question. If Truman knew the emperor wanted peace, why didn't he just accept a conditional surrender and save 140,000 lives? Because of what else was in those cables. In the same message where Togo said the emperor wanted peace, he also wrote, and this is a direct quote from the Intercept, "We are not asking the Russians mediation in anything like unconditional surrender." Ambassador Sato, reading the situation far more clearly than his bosses in Tokyo, cabled back on July 31st, "There is no alternative but immediate unconditional surrender." Tokyo ignored him. And that was the fundamental problem with Door 4. Japan wanted out of the war, but it couldn't agree on what out looked like. The peace faction wanted one condition: keep the emperor. The war faction demanded 4: keep the emperor, no occupation, self-disarmament, and Japan runs its own war crimes trials. Those last 3 were non-starters for the Allies, and the 6 men who held the decision couldn't reach unanimity. Togo couldn't give Sato any concrete proposal because the Supreme Council had never agreed on one. There were also 2 back channels running through Switzerland. The Fujimura Channel, a naval commander reaching out through a German intermediary to Alan Dulles at the OSS station in Bern, and the Per Jacobson Channel, a Swedish economist at the Bank for International Settlements, passing messages from Japanese officials. Jacobson's contacts said they no longer questioned the principle of unconditional surrender. They just wanted assurances about the imperial family. But neither channel carried any authorization from Tokyo. They were freelancers. And when the Japanese military found out about Fujimura's outreach, the response from headquarters was blunt. Japan's policy is to fight to the end. So here's the bind Truman was in. Magic showed him a Japan where the emperor wanted peace, but couldn't deliver it, because the men with the guns wouldn't let the men with the pens write a surrender. And even if Truman had offered to keep the emperor, which, by the way, is exactly what America ended up doing anyway, Hirohito stayed on the throne until 1989. There was no guarantee the military hardliners would have obeyed a surrender order. How do we know that? Because of what happened on the night of August 14th. But I'll get to that in a minute. First, there's one more player in this story that most people forget. And this player might have mattered more than the bomb itself: the Soviet Union. On August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki, Stalin declared war on Japan and launched Operation August Storm into Manchuria. 1.5 million Soviet troops poured across the border and annihilated the Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Now, most Western tellings treat this as a footnote. Hiroshima ended the war. The Soviets just piled on. But in 2005, Japanese-American historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa published a book called Racing the Enemy that dropped a bomb of its own on the historical establishment. His argument, built on Japanese, Soviet, and American archives simultaneously, was stark. The Soviet entry into the war played a greater role than the atomic bombs in forcing Japan's surrender. Think about it from Tokyo's perspective. The firebombing of 67 cities hadn't broken them. One more city destroyed, even by a terrifying new weapon, was, in a grotesque way, just more of the same. But the Soviet declaration of war? That destroyed something the bombs couldn't touch: hope. Japan's entire diplomatic strategy for months had been to use Moscow as a mediator for a negotiated peace. When Stalin attacked, that last door slammed shut. There was no one left to negotiate through. Hasegawa's thesis hit the field like an earthquake. Even Richard Rhodes, who wrote the definitive history of the Manhattan Project, said Hasegawa changed my mind, but not everyone agreed. Richard Frank fired back in the H-Diplo Roundtable, arguing that Hasegawa distorts the whole picture by minimizing the military elements. Frank pointed to something Hasegawa downplayed. When Hirohito finally broke the deadlock, his August 15th broadcast to the nation cited a new and most cruel bomb. He did not mention the Soviets. If the Soviet entry was the real trigger, why didn't the emperor say so? Japanese historian Sadao Asada offered a third angle. Writing in the Pacific Historical Review, he argued using Japanese primary sources that the Soviet shock was indirect. It closed a diplomatic door. But the bomb delivered a direct threat of atomic extinction of the Japanese people. It wasn't just another city burning, it was the promise that cities would keep vanishing, one by one, with a single airplane. So which was it? The bomb or the Soviets? Here's where I land, and I think the evidence supports this. It was both. And neither alone was enough. Because here's the fact that demolishes both the bomb ended it and the Soviets ended it narratives in one stroke. After Hiroshima, after the Soviet invasion, After Nagasaki, the Supreme War Council met, and they were still deadlocked 3-3. 2 atomic bombs and a million-man Soviet offensive, and the 6 most powerful men in Japan could not agree to stop fighting. It took something that had never happened before in Japanese history. Emperor Hirohito personally intervened, the Seidan, the sacred decision, and ordered surrender. One man, in one room, at 2 in the morning, broke a tie that 2 nuclear weapons and the largest land offensive in Asian history could not break. And even that almost wasn't enough. On the night of August 14th, hours after the surrender was finalized, Major Kenji Hatanaka led a group of officers into the imperial palace. They murdered Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, the commander of the palace guards, when he refused to join their coup. They forged orders under his seal. They deployed soldiers to seal the palace gates, and they launched a frantic search for one thing: the phonograph recordings of the emperor's surrender broadcast. If they could find and destroy those records before they aired the next morning, the surrender could be stopped. They searched all night. They never found them. A palace official had smuggled the recordings out and hidden them in a pile of laundry in a servant's quarters. By 8 a.m., the Eastern District Army, under General Tanaka, refused to back the coup. It collapsed. Hatanaka shot himself on the palace grounds. His co-conspirator committed seppuku. War Minister Anami, the most powerful voice against surrender, went home, wrote a final letter, and took his own life with a blade across his abdomen. At noon on August 15th, the emperor's voice crackled across Japanese radio, for the first time in history, telling his people to bear the unbearable. The war was over, barely. So, was the atomic bombing of Hiroshima really inevitable? No. 3 other doors existed. Every one of them was real. The military had war-gamed them. The diplomats had explored them. The plans were on paper, the ships were in position, the medals were already stamped. But look at what was behind each door. Door 2, invasion, meant somewhere between 40,000 and 4 million American casualties, 5 to 10 million Japanese dead, and a very real chance that Stalin would have seized Hokkaido and split Japan in half like Korea. We know this wasn't fantasy because on August 16th, 2 days after the surrender, Stalin wrote to Truman requesting a Soviet occupation zone on Hokkaido. Truman said no. He could say no because the war was already over. If it wasn't, if the invasion was still months away, that letter might have read very differently. And today, there might be a North Japan and a South Japan. Door 3, blockade and starvation, might have killed 11 million Japanese civilians from famine alone, more than 70 times the death toll of Hiroshima. The humane option was potentially the deadliest of all. Door 4, diplomacy, required Japan's military to accept terms they were willing to die rather than sign. And on the night of August 14th, a group of them proved they meant it literally. The bomb wasn't the only way out. It was the fastest way out. And in August 1945, speed was the difference between one Japan and two. Between a country that rebuilt into the world's 3rd largest economy and a country that might have spent 40 years divided by a wall and an ideology. The way Germany did, the way Korea still does. That's not a comfortable conclusion. It shouldn't be. 140,000 people died in Hiroshima, most of them civilians who had nothing to do with the decisions made in Tokyo or Washington. History doesn't owe us comfortable conclusions. It owes us honest ones. So what do you think? Knowing what you know now, all 4 doors, all 4 nightmares, would you have made the same call Truman did? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into this era, I just finished a video on whether the Korean War was really inevitable. That war was a direct consequence of how World War II ended. Different doors, same kind of nightmare. I'll leave it right here. History doesn't move in straight lines. It turns on single nights, single votes, single men refusing to hand over a set of phonograph records hidden in a pile of laundry. And sometimes, the door you walk through decides the shape of the world for the next 80 years.